The village of Ember Hollow had not seen a human in 3 generations. The elders spoke of them sometimes, in the careful way elders speak of things they are not entirely sure were real. Creatures of soft skin and short lives, who built clever things with their strange flat fingers, and who burned no fire of their own, yet somehow never seemed cold. The youngest dragons had grown up thinking humans were something between legend and rumor, like sea serpents or talking stones, things that existed somewhere perhaps, but not here, never here. So when Aldrich Voss limped through the stone archway of Ember Hollow on a gray Tuesday morning, the market did not erupt into panic or fury. It did something quieter and in many ways more powerful. It simply stopped. A fishmonger froze mid-price with his mouth open. 2 hatchlings who had been chasing each other around the fountain planted their feet and stared. A cart dragon so startled herself that she dropped an entire crate of ember root, and not one head turned at the sound, because every pair of eyes in the square was already occupied. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still, as though it too wanted a better look. Aldrich Voss did not appear to be a remarkable man by any measure his own kind would recognize. He was old, the deeply, honestly old that comes not from giving up, but from simply continuing longer than most. His leather satchel was worn soft as cloth at the straps. His spectacles sat crooked on his nose at an angle that suggested they had been sat on at least once and bent back into approximate shape. He walked with a limp that favored his left side, unhurried, as though the leg had made its peace with the situation years ago, and so had he. He moved through the frozen market without hurry, without nervousness, without the wide eyes of a man who knows he is being watched by 100 creatures who could breathe fire. He simply looked around, the way anyone looks around a new place, noting the foul. No one approached him for a long while. This was not entirely surprising. Ember Hollow was a village of dignified creatures, and dignified creatures do not rush toward the unknown simply because it has set up a table. They observe. They consider. They discuss the matter in low voices with whoever is standing nearest, and then they consider some more. And by the time they have finished considering, they have usually talked themselves into both action and inaction simultaneously, which results in nobody moving at all. So they watched. Mothers drew hatchlings close beneath their wings with the automatic, wordless pull of instinct, not squeezing, not fleeing, simply gathering, the way a wing moves over something precious when the sky looks uncertain. Merchants leaned on their stalls and stared with the open, unashamed curiosity of people who have decided that staring is technically not rude if the subject is unusual enough to justify it. A fruit seller whispered something to the potter beside her. The potter whispered back. Neither of them looked away from the table for even a moment during the exchange. And the butcher, a broad, gray-scaled elder named Doss, who had survived 40 years of market days and prided himself on his composure, simply forgot to breathe. He stood with a side of elk raised in both claws and his chest perfectly still and his eyes fixed on the human. And it was not until his apprentice tugged gently on his tail that he remembered the basic requirements of being alive, and inhaled again. Aldrich sat through all of it without any visible discomfort. He cleaned his spectacles on his shirt. Then he straightened one of his tools on the table. He watched the fountain with the expression of a man who finds fountains genuinely interesting. Then Sorrow made her entrance. She was small even for a hatchling, emerald-scaled, bright-eyed, and moving at the particular velocity of a young creature who is thinking about 3 things at once, and clutched in her claws was a stuffed wyvern. It had seen better days, considerably better, and considerably longer ago. One glass eye was gone entirely, leaving behind only a small dark socket that gave the creature a lopsided, slightly bewildered expression. The seam along its belly had split at some point and been left to split further, so that small clouds of wool stuffing escaped from it with every movement, drifting upward in the still market air like tiny, lazy snow. The fabric was worn thin in the places it had been held most, along the neck, behind the ears, at the base of the tail, worn in the way that only years of being carried everywhere by someone who needed it can wear a thing. Sorrow did not appear to notice any of this. Or rather, she noticed the way you notice something you stopped seeing long ago because it has simply become part of what the thing is. The wyvern was hers. It had always looked like this. That was the end of the matter. She clutched it tighter when she realized the human was looking at it. Aldrich did not reach for it. He did not lean forward, did not gesture, did not make any of the sudden movements that might cause a startled hatchling to bolt. He simply looked at the stuffed wyvern with a thoughtful, unhurried expression and said, in a voice pitched low and conversational, "That fellow looks like he's had a rough week." There was no mockery in it. No pity either. Just the plain, kind observation of someone who looks at worn things and sees their history rather than their damage. Sorrow glanced down at the wyvern, then back up at the human. But something in her grip loosened by a fraction. Aldrich opened his hand and held it out, palm facing upward. He did not ask. He did not insist. He simply offered the space and left the decision entirely where it belonged. Sorrow stood there for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't quite name. The problem was that everything about him made grabbing feel impossible. He worked slowly. This was the first thing Sorrow noticed. Not the tools themselves, though those were interesting enough. The needle was thin and curved, the thread a deep burgundy that matched the wyvern's faded stitching with suspicious accuracy, as though he had looked at it and known. The glass eyes were kept in a small, squat jar, sorted by color in a way that suggested long habit. Browns together, blacks together, greens and grays and ambers each in their own quiet section, rattling softly against the glass when he lifted the jar and tilted it toward the light. But it was the slowness that held her. He did not rush. He did not have the tightened jaw and quick fingers of someone trying to finish. Every movement was considered and complete before the next one began, the needle drawing thread through fabric with steady, even pulls, and the seam closing behind it in a clean and careful line. He paused twice to examine his work, tilting the wyvern toward the afternoon light that fell long and gold across his table, checking the tension of the stitching with a thumbnail before continuing. The market moved around them. Stalls opened and closed. Conversations resumed, cautious at first, then finding their ordinary volume. Hatchlings who had been held back by careful wings gradually crept forward until there was a loose and growing semicircle of small dragons watching the human's hands with enormous eyes, none of them speaking, none of them wanting to be the one who broke whatever this was. Sorrow stood closest. She did not move for the entire time he worked. When he finished the seam, he set it down, opened the jar, and selected a glass eye with the same unhurried care, holding 3 different ones against the empty socket before choosing, discarding the ones that were wrong by some small degree only he could measure. He pressed the chosen eye gently into place, checked it, and then held the wyvern out to her. It looked not new, it looked restored. Why, by the end of that first day, there was a line stretching past the fountain. It had not formed all at once. It grew the way most true things grow. Slowly, then with sudden conviction. First, it was only the hatchlings who had been watching from the semicircle, nudging each other forward with the particular courage that comes from not wanting to go first, but desperately wanting someone else to. Then an older dragon with a cracked lantern arrived, moving with the careful casualness of someone who happened to be passing and merely stopped by coincidence. Then a grandmother carrying something wrapped in cloth with both hands, the way you carry something that matters. Then there was simply a line, and it stretched past the fountain. And no one remarked on how quickly it had appeared, because remarking on it would have required admitting that an entire village of proud and cautious dragons had collectively decided, within the span of a single afternoon, to trust a human they had met 3 hours ago. They brought him everything they had stopped believing could be fixed. Broken toys arrived in all conditions. A wooden horse with 3 legs, a carved bird whose wings had snapped at the joints, a knitted bear so loved and so ancient it was more patch than original at this point, holding together through sentiment as much as thread. Cracked lanterns came wrapped in cloth to protect the remaining glass, their owners explaining the damage with the apologetic tone of people who feel personally responsible for the fragility of things. A clockwork beetle missing its key. You're a pull toy whose wheels had seized. A doll with a crushed porcelain cheek that 3 previous attempts had failed to restore. And then, near the middle of the line, carried by a careful elder with ceremonial solemnity, came a music box. It was beautiful, even broken. Dark wood inlaid with copper, shaped like a sleeping dragon curled around its own tail. The elder said only that it had not sung in a... He was given a room above the candlemaker's shop. There was no formal meeting about this. No elder stood before the village and declared it. No vote was called. No committee was formed to weigh the appropriateness of housing a human above a place that sold open flame to dragons who breathed it anyway. It simply happened, in the way that certain things happen in small, old communities where everyone knows everything about everyone, and decisions get made through a kind of invisible collective current that moves beneath ordinary conversation like a river beneath ice. Marin, the candle maker, was a stout, amber-scaled woman of few words and considerable practical intelligence. She had watched Aldrich work from her doorway for most of that first afternoon. By evening, she had made her assessment, and by the following morning she had aired out the room above her shop, replaced the moth-eaten curtain on the window with something decent, and left her door unlocked with a key sitting on the inside sill where it could not be missed. She did not make an announcement about any of this. She simply went back to making candles. Food began appearing at his door each morning with similar wordlessness, wrapped in cloth or packed in small clay containers left on the step before he woke. He never caught anyone leaving it. He tried once, rising before dawn and sitting quietly by the door, and heard only retreating footsteps and what might have been the sound of someone trying very hard not to let their tail scrape the cobblestones. He ate everything gratefully and left the containers clean on the step, and they were always gone by the time he came back up from the market. The workbench appeared by the end of the week. This, unlike the room and the food, involved considerable visible effort and considerable audible disagreement. 4 dragons from the carpenter's quarter had taken it upon themselves to build Aldrich a proper workbench, a real one, solid and fitted with... The hatchlings came to him the way young things come to anyone who makes them feel safe. Gradually, then all at once. It began with distance. For the first few days after that initial afternoon, they watched him from across the square with the elaborate pretense of not watching him, suddenly very interested in the fountain, in the cobblestones, in whatever their companions were doing, as long as that thing happened to be located within clear sight line of his workbench. They were not fooling anyone, least of all Aldrich, who had learned decades ago that being watched by something young and curious feels entirely different from being watched by something wary, and he found the former considerably more pleasant than the latter. Then the distance began to close. A few feet at a time, a day at a time. On the way a tide comes in, each wave retreating slightly but leaving the waterline a little further up the shore than before. By the end of the first week, there were usually 3 or 4 hatchlings settled within easy conversation distance of his workbench, doing various things that were definitely not watching him work, except that they absolutely were. Then all at once, they simply arrived. One morning he came down to his workbench, and there they were, a small and varied collection of young dragons arranged around it with the casual air of creatures who had always been there and intended to remain, and that was simply how it was from then on. Sorrow came first every morning without exception. She always brought something: a toy with a loose button, a small mechanism with a stuck gear, once a carved wooden fish with a crack along its tail that was, Aldrich suspected, not nearly serious enough to require professional attention. The broken things were not really the point. They were simply the socially acceptable architecture of arrival, the reason she could appear at his workbench each morning without having to explain that she wanted to be there, which would, do humans really cry water? Aldrich had looked up from his work at that one, considered it with genuine thoughtfulness, and said yes, they did, and that it was called crying, and that it happened when feelings became too large to stay entirely inside a person. Fenn had stared at him for a long moment, and then written something in the dirt with his claw, which Aldrich suspected was a note to himself, and then immediately asked the next question. "Can you breathe smoke if you try hard enough?" "No," Aldrich had told him. Not really, though he had known miners who came close. Fenn found this deeply disappointing and spent the following 10 minutes explaining in considerable detail exactly how he would go about teaching a human to breathe smoke if he were in charge of such a project, which Aldrich listened to with full attention and only mild concern. "Is it true humans name their swords?" "Some do," Aldrich said. "Not all." He himself had never owned a sword. Fenn looked at him with the expression of someone receiving information that fundamentally rearranges their understanding of a subject. He was quiet for almost 4 entire minutes after that one, which was by Fenn's standards a profound and meditative silence. This was how it always went. Aldrich answered every question with the same careful, level attention he brought to his repairs. No question waved aside as too small, none treated as foolish, none answered with the tired half-attention that adults so often gave to the questions of the young. He answered as though each one mattered, because to Fenn each one did, and Aldrich was old enough and perceptive enough to understand that the fastest way to make a curious creature stop being curious is to make it feel that curiosity is an inconvenience. The effect on Fenn was immediate and lasting. He left each conversation walking slightly taller than he had arrived, with the particular bearing of a creature who has been taken seriously and knows it. It made him fife. The music box was the hardest job. It had been sitting at the corner of his workbench for 4 days before he touched it, not from avoidance, but from respect. Some things require looking at before they require working on. The box was dark wood inlaid with copper, shaped like a sleeping dragon curled around its own tail, the craftsmanship so fine and so old that Aldrich spent a long time simply turning it in his hands, learning it before he presumed to open it. The copper had gone green in the grooves. The wood had dried and contracted over decades of silence, pulling slightly away from its own joints. Whatever had lived inside it had not been asked to sing in a very long time. When he finally opened the base panel, he understood why. The mechanism inside was a small catastrophe of neglect, not malicious, not careless, but simply the accumulated consequence of time moving through a thing that had stopped moving itself. The mainspring had fractured at its narrowest point, a clean break that spoke of one final winding too many long ago. The gears had seized where moisture had gotten in and dried again, leaving rust in the teeth like old arguments. 2 of the tines on the comb were bent, which would have flattened those notes into something unrecognizable even if everything else had worked. He worked on it across parts of 3 days, fitting it in around other repairs, returning to it in quiet moments. He sourced a replacement spring from a clockmaker's remnant kit at the bottom of his satchel, too large by a fraction, requiring careful reworking with a file so small it was almost theoretical. He freed the gears with oil and patience, working each one loose by degrees, cleaning the rust from the teeth with a tool he had made himself from a modified pin years ago for exactly this kind of work. He straightened the bent tines with a steady hand and a piece of smooth hardwood, applying pressure so gradual it was barely pressure at all. Sorrow watched every, "My mother sang that," Vel said softly. The words arrived quietly, the way very old memories arrive when something unexpected unlocks them. Not rushing in, but settling, like something that had been waiting a long time in a patient place and had simply been given permission to come forward. Her voice carried no performance of grief, no dramatized weight. It was the plain, unguarded tone of genuine remembrance, which is always more moving than anything practiced could be. Her eyes were still closed. Her head remained bowed at that slight angle, tilted toward something located 80 years away and entirely invisible to everyone else in the square. The melody continued for another few bars, unhurried, giving her whatever it was she needed from it before the spring reached its end and the final note thinned and was gone. The silence that followed was the good kind. The kind that exists not because nothing is happening, but because what just happened deserves a moment of uninterrupted space before the world resumes its ordinary business. Aldrich looked at Grandmother Vel for a moment. Then he looked at the music box in his hands, the copper gone green in the grooves, the sleeping dragon curled around its own tail, the mechanism inside now clean and moving and whole again after decades of held silence. He set it down on the workbench with the same care he gave everything, gently, without sound. He said nothing, not from uncertainty or discomfort, but because he understood, in the way that people who have lived long enough to lose things understand, that this was not a moment that required his voice. There was nothing to explain, nothing to add, nothing that words could improve upon. Grandmother Vel was somewhere else, briefly, with someone she loved, and the most respectful thing anyone could offer that was simply to not interrupt. The market resumed itself slowly around them, sounds returning by degrees. A cartwheel, a distant conversation, tea. Weeks passed, then months. Time in a small village moves differently than it does elsewhere. It is not slower, exactly, but more layered, each day settling over the last like sediment, building up a kind of depth that makes the place feel older and more itself with every passing season. Ember Hollow had been accumulating this depth for a very long time, and it absorbed Aldrich Voss into its layers with the same unhurried thoroughness it applied to everything else that had ever decided to stay. His corner by the fountain stopped being remarkable. This was perhaps the most significant thing that happened, and it happened so gradually that no one noticed it occurring, only noticed one ordinary morning that it had already occurred. The workbench by the fountain was simply part of the square now, and as unremarkable and as necessary as the fountain itself, as the market stalls, as the particular cobblestone near the east entrance that everyone knew to step around because it rocked underfoot. It was simply there, and he was simply there behind it, and the village moved around both of them with the ease of long familiarity. Dragons who had frozen in place on that first morning now called greetings across the market without looking up from what they were doing. Not performed greetings, not the careful, considered hellos of people being deliberately welcoming, just the automatic, thoughtless acknowledgement of someone whose presence is so established it would be strange not to greet them. The fishmonger, who had stood open-mouthed on that first day, now left the best of his morning catch on the corner of the workbench on Tuesdays, which was when Aldrich had once mentioned, in passing, that he was fond of fish. The fruit seller knew he liked the smaller ember roots roasted rather than raw. The potter had made him a proper cup after noticing he was using his water vessel as a vase. Small accumulations of knowledge, the kind that only develop between people way. One autumn morning, Aldrich rose early and began quietly to pack his satchel. The season had turned overnight in the way it sometimes does in old villages built close to hills, not gradually, not with warning, but with a single decisive shift of air that arrives while everyone is sleeping and leaves the world categorically different by morning. The light coming through his window above the candlemaker's shop was the particular pale gold of autumn, thinner than summer light, carrying in it the faint smell of wood smoke and turned earth and something else beneath those, something older and harder to name that meant simply and unmistakably that the warm time was ending. He lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling, the way he had lain still in many rooms, in many places over many years, taking the particular inventory of a man who has always moved on. The feeling was familiar. It had lived in him for so long it had become a kind of default, a background condition he no longer questioned. The sense, arriving with the season's turn, that it was time. He rose before the village woke, dressed quietly, stood for a moment at the window looking down at the empty square, at the fountain catching the early light, at his workbench standing in its corner with his tools arranged on it in their proper order. Then he turned from the window and began to pack. He told himself he was being discreet about it. He moved slowly and deliberately, folding things with care, placing them into the satchel in the order they had always gone. Tools first, wrapped in their cloth, then the notebook with Fenn's questions. And then the small personal things that accumulate around a person who has stayed somewhere long enough to put things down. He did not make unnecessary noise. He did not open the window. He was, he believed, being very quiet about the whole thing. He was not being quiet about it at all. The difficulty was that Ember Hollow had spent months learning him, and of V. He came downstairs and stood in the doorway. He had taken his time about it. After stepping back from the window, he had stood in the middle of his room for a while, looking at the half-packed satchel on the bed, at the flowers on the windowsill in their improvised vase, at the small accumulated evidence of months in a place. The cup the potter had made him, the notebook thick with Fenn's questions, the extra candles Marin left outside his door on cold evenings without ever mentioning it. He had looked at all of it for long enough that the looking became a kind of conversation with himself, the kind that doesn't use words, because words would make it too easy to argue. Then he had come downstairs. He stood in the doorway of the candlemaker's shop and looked at them, and they looked at him, and the autumn morning held itself carefully around the moment, as though it understood the weight of what was happening and had decided to be still for it. They had gathered the way Ember Hollow always gathered, without ceremony, without hierarchy of placement, simply present. The adults stood in the loose, natural clustering of people who have come to the same place for the same reason, without coordinating their arrival. The elders were toward the back, not from lesser feeling, but from the long-practiced dignity of creatures who have learned to take up less visible space when the young need the front. Doss the butcher stood with his arms at his sides and his expression doing several things at once, none of them comfortable. An elder Voss, no relation, had his eyes fixed on a point somewhere near Aldrich's left shoulder with the focused neutrality of someone maintaining composure through sheer structural will, and the hatchlings were pressed to the front. Of course they were. They always were. They had not yet acquired the adult understanding that stepping back is sometimes a form of dignity, and so they stood where feeling had pushed them, which was as close as Poe. "Can you stay forever?" she asked. The words came out in a voice so carefully held together, it was almost not a voice at all, thin as the first ice on still water, the kind that holds, but only just, that would not survive any additional pressure. She had assembled the sentence with everything she had, and it had cost her the full amount, and she stood very still after saying it in the way of someone who has spent everything and is waiting to find out if it was enough. The question moved through the gathered crowd of Ember Hollow like weather. It did not surprise anyone. It was, in the way of certain things said by the young, the precise and undecorated version of what every person in the square was carrying but had not found the shape for. And the adults felt it land in their chests with the particular resonance of truth spoken plainly by someone too young to know it should be complicated. The elders, who had lived long enough to have lost many things they had not thought to ask to keep, felt it somewhere older and quieter than the chest. Fenn, who was standing 3 hatchlings to Sorrow's left, fixed his eyes on the cobblestones with an intensity that suggested he had discovered something extremely important about their arrangement and was studying it with complete and total concentration and was absolutely not doing anything else whatsoever. Mira was watching Aldrich. She was the only one who was, directly and without deflection, her dark eyes steady and clear, carrying in them the same quality they always carried at his workbench. On that deep and patient attention that missed nothing and demanded nothing. She was not pleading. She was not performing. She was simply looking at him with the full and honest weight of someone who wants a thing and has decided that the most dignified offering she can make is to let him see that clearly. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the workbench in its corner by the fountain. His workbench, built to, "I'll need a better chair," he said. 3 words into the sentence the square was already changing, something releasing in the air of it, a collective held breath beginning its slow return to the body. By the time he reached back, the quality of the silence had shifted entirely, from the taut and fragile silence of waiting into something warmer and more habitable, the silence of people who have just received news they had not allowed themselves to fully hope for and are still arriving at the fact of it. He said it simply, practically, in the tone of a man making a reasonable domestic observation, which it was, and which it also was not, and everyone present understood both things simultaneously without needing to discuss it. The chair was hard on his back. This was true. Or it was also the declaration of a man who intends to have a back worth considering tomorrow, and the day after, and in all the seasons following this one. Ember Hollow heard it correctly. Fenn's head snapped up from the cobblestones. The investigation he had been conducting into their arrangement ended instantaneously, abandoned without ceremony, every pretense of detachment gone in the single moment his eyes found Aldrich's face and confirmed what the words had suggested. His expression cycled through approximately 4 distinct emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Relief, joy, the particular delight of someone who has just identified an opportunity to be immediately and physically useful, and then settled into something that looked very much like purpose. "I know where there's a good chair," he announced, and with the ringing certainty of someone delivering information of the highest strategic importance. "It's at the timber yard. I've seen it. It's the right height and everything." A pause of approximately half a breath. "I'll go right now. Immediately. Right now." He was already moving before the last word left his mouth, turning and pushing through the crowd with the focused